So this book by Talal Asad, Secular Translations, is offering a deep and critical exploration of secularism, translation, and the modern state. Through careful analysis, our author reveals how secularism is not a neutral space, but a system of governance deeply intertwined with power and exclusion. He critiques the modern reliance on calculative reason, warning of its dehumanizing effects and the dangers it poses for the future. The book invites all of us to reconsider the assumptions behind secularism and to think critically about the role of religion, tradition, and the body in modern life. Finish reading Secular Translations, Nation State, Modern Self, and Calculative Reason by Talal Asad. So this is a book review of this particular book that has been written by Talal Asad. Secular Translations. What is secular translations? The book explores the complexities of secularism, focusing on its relation to translation, the body, and calculative reason. These three things which I want to elaborate with you in this video. The book examines how secular values, including notions of equality, freedom, and rationality, evolve from religious origins, but then are transformed in their modern application within nation states. What Asad does is that he challenges the assumption that secularism is neutral, presenting it as a system of governance deeply tied to power and exclusion. Talal, of course, has made some really important contributions in the field of what's called cultural anthropology, secularization discourse, post-colonialism, and Islamic studies. In his two really important monographs, which everyone should really read, Genealogies of Religion and Formations of the Secular, what Talal Asad does is that he problematizes the Western notion of modernity and reveals the mechanisms of invisible imposition upon both Western and non-Western society. This particular book, Secular Translations, is really an expanded version of the inaugural Ruth Benedict lectures delivered at Columbia University in 2017, and encompasses the entire matrix and his themes from his previous volumes, but with a more interesting orientation towards an uncertain future. So where are we going with our certain projects and modernity in the world right now? One of the things Talal Asad really focuses on is on the notion of secularism and translation. And what he does is that he positions secularism as not a straightforward replacement of religion, but as a form of translation. What secularism does is that it translates religious concepts into the modern political vocabulary, such as the transformation of Christian ideas into the values of equality and human rights. In the first essay of 3 in this book, the essay is called Secular Equality and Religious Language, he addresses what's called the Habermasian thesis, which is that core values of secularization and classical liberalism are translations from Christian history. What Talal Asad argues is that this translation is not seamless. It often involves the adoption and exclusion of certain aspects of religious traditions. In his book, he highlights this process and shows that it's neither neutral nor universal, and it often favors certain religious heritages, particularly or primarily Christianity, over others, especially in Western contexts. For example, this can be seen in how European nations engage with Muslim immigrants, often invoking a secularism rooted in Christian moral values that implicitly excludes those who do not share this heritage. Talal Asad argues that political liberalism cannot secure an equal free space for non-Westerners, such as Muslims, for example, because it's almost like an exclusive boundary that discriminates against people who cannot resonate with the language of Western modernity. Another thing that's important in his book is this idea of ambiguities of secular equality, and this is really, really important once you really engage with the book. Secular states, especially when you think about liberal democracies, often champion equality as a foundational value. Asad argues that this version of equality is ambiguous. He says it claims to be neutral, but often what we really find under the bonnet is that it perpetuates exclusion, particularly for minority religious groups. For example, the notion of equality within a secular state can result, in fact, in policies that marginalize certain communities. Again, Muslims are an example, who are seen as incompatible with the secular nation's identity. So what Asad does is that he explores how this exclusion is embedded in the legal and political frameworks of secular states, where the idea of neutrality is used, in fact, to justify inequalities. Another thing he is particularly focused upon is what I would call the limits of translation. And this really comes to the fore in the second chapter of the book. Talal Asad calls it untranslatability, particularly in the context of embodied religious practices. He critiques the modern assumption that all values and practices can be translated into some form of a secular framework. So when we think about our ritualized prayers, he critiques this idea and says you can't always translate this into some sort of secular framework. Some religious practices and traditions are deeply rooted in the body and cannot be easily rationalized or translated into secular terms without losing their essence. So when we start to think about, as Muslims, about prayer, and we try to make that accessible to non-Muslims, to Westerners, can we really do it? Can they really understand what prayer really means to us, or fasting, what it really means to us? Because these are rituals that are embodied. You have to practice it. You have to do it to really try and understand what's going on. So he gives examples, for examples, of rituals that engage the body. He calls it a sensible body in his book, and these resist being fully captured by secular reasoning. This presents a real challenge for secular states because they want to regulate or translate religious practices into legal or political terms, and the net result of all of this is misunderstandings and misinterpretations. In this chapter, what Asad also does is that he elucidates the difficulty of translating between the Islamic tradition and a Western modernity that's rooted in what we would claim to be a Judeo-Christianity. And he does this through analysis of Imam Ghazali, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and the full understanding of religious practices and concepts cannot be separated from the contemplation of their practice and larger structures, because religious language is a product of ritualization that encompasses the whole religious experience. So it's problematic to regard religious language as a purely abstract notion without considering the process and structure of this ritualization. So the Quran's hermeneutics, for example, and the Muslim prayer are distinctively different from Western equivalents, and therefore cultivate dissimilar forms of logic, virtue, and politics. And this is really important for students when, as Muslims, we write, and we're trying to write for a non-Western audience. So his book is really important for people who want to enter that space to be aware of his ideas here. So when one does not consider this difference and tries to translate the will and intention of a Muslim through the modern lens, it is possible to wrongfully label these things. For example, if you think about Saifullah Saipov, who was the Manhattan truck attacker, he would be located as a religiously inspired terrorist, while the Las Vegas shooter, Stephen Paddock, would be translated as being a pure or merely a lunatic. But there's no religious language with him. So what Asad does, and he argues, is that this mistake arises from a lack of understanding about the limitations of the modern concept of secular translation. So this second essay really focuses on the untranslatable areas that we cannot really penetrate unless we practice those bodies. The latter half of the essay, the same essay in this book, engages in a discussion of ritual, and this is a prominent concept which is debated in anthropology since the early days of the discipline, so to do with human practice. And Talal Asad, in his other book, Genealogies of Religion, has written about this exclusively. Again, he comes to Imam Ghazali, and he looks at Imam Ghazali's discussion on the ongoing creation and orientation of the self. And what Asad does is he approaches the translation of Quranic language into the sensible body as a kind of ritual, wherein through various somatic components. Somatic components are things that are to do with the body as opposed to the mind. So if you think about Muslims performing their rituals, that has a somatic component to it. It's to do with the body, less to do with the mind. And how the agent strives to adopt the right feelings and thoughts crucial for the formation of the self. So we think about the niyyah, the intention that Muslims are taught to do before they engage in a righteous action. Now, doubtlessly, there exist multiple notions of the self, as any genealogy of the concept would attest. Asad accordingly points to this Cartesian heritage patent in conceptions of the modern individual that have rendered human corporality as distinct from the self. So the body is distinct from the mind. A severing that colors most secular explanations of action that rely on psychological dynamics of internal cause and effect. This is a self that is increasingly defined by secular disciplines of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, which assume that an individual's willful intention is ascertainable. The question of intent and willful action, however, is also entangled with the distinction between an authentic self and its public appearance, a gap that generates much anxiety for the security apparatus of the modern nation state. And this really leads me into his discussion on masks, security, and numbers. And many of us are, when we read this chapter, will be familiar because we are all kind of put under the pressure of numbers and measuring people's behaviors and actions and monitoring things. So in this third and final chapter, what he does is he shifts the focus to how modern secular states use what's called calculative reason in the form of statistics and numbers to govern people, to govern populations. And he critiques this reliance, the modern reliance on quantitative data to make decisions about governance, security, and even morality. And the use of numbers and statistics, while it may appear neutral and rational, can actually dehumanize individuals by reducing them to data points. What Asad does is he suggests that this form of calculative reason is central to the modern state's governance strategies, but it also creates a number of ethical dilemmas because you're prioritizing efficiency and control over human complexity, and this can lead to policies which further exacerbate inequalities and injustices. He also talks about this idea of secularism as power, and he challenges the notion that secularism is this neutral space which is free from religious influence. Instead, he presents the idea that secularism is a system of governance deeply intertwined with power. Secular states often frame their political power in ways that maintain inequalities, particularly for religious minorities. For example, the concept of legal equality in secular states often masks deeper structural inequalities. Asad critiques the liberal democratic states' claim to be neutral and to be inclusive, showing how secularism often enforces exclusions through legal and political means. The role of religion is also important. No conversation about secularity or modernity would be worth its weight without discussion of religion. So, despite this ongoing claim of neutrality, religious language and practice continue to play a significant role in the functioning of modern states. And the author highlights how secularism does not fully escape from its religious roots, but rather reinterprets and transforms them. Religious concepts such as human dignity are often redefined in secular terms, but they retain traces of their religious origins. And this then creates tensions in secular states where religious and secular values kind of coexist in a very uneasy relationship. Our author points out that this tension is not necessarily resolved by secularism. Instead, it is managed through selective translation and reinterpretation of religious values. I want to just return back to the sensible body and the rational self, the sensible body versus the rational self. What the author does is he contrasts the modern secular focus on the rational autonomous self with the concept of the sensible body, a body shaped by tradition, ritual and religious practices, and many people who are believers will be familiar with the latter. In secular societies, the rational self is celebrated as the ideal citizen, autonomous, calculable, and detached from religious traditions. However, Asad argues that this model of the self overlooks the importance of the body in religious practices in shaping moral and ethical behavior. And so his concept of the sensible body, and as religious believers will understand, resists the rationalization impulse of secularism. And this again creates a tension between secular governance and religious practices. Of course, with calculative reasons, this creates a dangerous problem for us living in the world today. The use of numbers, statistics, and calculation to govern and to make decisions. And Asad warns us that this particular form of reasoning, while it might be essential to governance, carries with it a huge number of risks. It can lead to dehumanization, and we've been watching that with what's happening in Gaza, for example, when technology is used to dehumanize people, and a reduction of individuals to mere data points, which in turn can justify harmful policies. We think about social media and the algorithms that are used there. And what Asad does is that he connects this reliance on calculative reason to broader environmental and political crises, such as climate change and the threat, which he is very clear on, of nuclear war. He argues that these crises are the dark side of modernity's triumph of reason and science, which prioritize efficiency and control over ethical considerations. In the concluding section of the book, what the author does is he reflects on the future of secularism in liberal democratic states. So this book by Talal Asad, Secular Translations, is offering a deep and critical exploration of secularism, translation, and the modern state. Through careful analysis, our author reveals how secularism is not a neutral space, but a system of governance deeply intertwined with power and exclusion. He critiques the modern reliance on calculative reason, warning of its dehumanizing effects and the dangers it poses for the future. The book invites all of us to reconsider the assumptions behind secularism and to think critically about the role of religion, tradition, and the body in modern life. Much more than being a valuable addition to scholarship, which is transdisciplinary, this is a pioneering work that generates a new world of understanding when it comes to the secular, that ever-shifting, elusive concept intertwined with our modern world. It's going to be useful for many disciplines, scholars in working in the field of anthropology, religion, political theory, and intellectual history for years to come. Thank you very much.